Hello and welcome. It's my pleasure as director of the Toby Center for Jewish Life and Learning to welcome you to today's TJHTalk session. We're delighted that you have chosen to be with us. Today, our guests will explore Polish museums in general, potentially challenging narratives, and how they tell the Jewish story. Before I introduce our guests, as usual, I would like to share the following guidelines for our program together. Our conversation will take approximately 45 minutes, and it will be followed by a 15-minute Q&A session. If you'd like to let us know where you are at the moment or what brings you here, or if you'd like to submit a question, please do so in the comment section. We remind you to subscribe to our YouTube channel if you'd like to view previous sessions or share the link with others. And it is now my privilege to welcome and introduce our scholars. Our moderator, Dr. Maria Kobielska, is a scholar of memory and assistant professor in Polish studies at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow, a member of the Research Center for Memory Cultures and of the Polish Association for Cultural Studies. Maria has written extensively on contemporary Polish literature and culture in the context of memory, trauma, and politics. Dr. Erika Lehrer is a sociocultural anthropologist and curator. She is a professor in the departments of history and sociology anthropology at Concordia University, Montreal, and is the founding director of the Curating and Public Scholarship Lab, PSL. Erika has authored seminal publications, and the Toby Center is pleased to have supported the publication of her book, Lucky Jews, which accompanied her curated exhibit, Souvenir Talisman Toy, at the Krakow Ethnographic Museum through our Sfarim book publishing program. We also want to congratulate Erika and her colleagues on receiving a 7-year, $2.5 million grant for their project, Thinking Through Museums, a partnership approach to curating difficult knowledge in public, from the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada. Mazal tov and gratuluję. Dr. Joanna Wawrzyniak is the director of the Center for Research on Social Memory and on the Faculty of Sociology at the University of Warsaw, and is also a prolific author. A sociologist and historian by training, Joanna specializes in memory studies, oral histories, and museum research. She has been leading a research group, City Museums and Multiple Colonial Pasts, in the framework of the ECHOES project. Maria, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for having me. I am honored and privileged to start this conversation about Polish museums, and it's my task now to sketch something like an introduction about how the idea of our conversation started, and to sketch some primary suggestion on the topics why research museums at all and why research museums in Poland. As a researcher dealing with Polish memory culture and especially with new Polish historical museums, I had the opportunity to be a guest editor of a special issue of Teksty Drugie on the topic. And we gathered articles of interdisciplinary perspectives to try to answer the question about defining Polish museum landscape, about placing Polish museums in global context, and about recognizing museums' political dependencies and influences. If I was to very shortly answer the question about why researching museums, I would say that museums can be approached as markers, as benchmarks of memory cultures, of collective memories, and of identities. And this is in particular visible in Poland, where the museum boom, and I would like us to see my first 2 slides now, makes this way of thinking especially tempting. This way of thinking when we think and research and interpret memory cultures through or via museums. On this slide, you can see just a fraction of what can be called a museum boom in contemporary Poland. That many important historical museums that I'm particularly interested in were founded during last 17 years. 2004 was the date, the opening date of the boom, when the spectacular Warsaw Rising Museum, a pioneer of the trend, was established and opened. And since then, we have a bunch of museums in virtually every region, every big city. Some of these museums are huge institutions, some are local ones, some aim at covering history of Poland as a whole, and some deal with particular moments in space and time. So basically, they are very various. When I say that the Warsaw Rising Museum can be seen as a pioneer, I mean that it was the first experience for many people in Poland with the new type of a museum. New type of a museum, which is, the first thing is that it is spectacular. And if we could see the next slide, we can think about this features of these museums that start often with museum buildings. Sometimes they are new, sometimes they adapt as historical and often industrial space, and are arranged so as to present us with these impressive exhibitions we can find inside. And the last slide, please. So these are museums that use diverse media, engage different senses, and encourage visitors to interact and present attractive stories. They aim at producing intensive, attractive, and diverse experiences for the visitors. And next slide, please. So one of the authors that we have in the issue writes, and I quote more or less, that museums can be seen as factories of collective memory and common historical knowledge, but also at the same time as strategically important bridgeheads of contemporary tribal wars. So, and it is very true, because this kind of a museum proves to be a useful political tool, a way of expressing identity, to stabilize or to modify collective memory and the way the past is remembered in the community. We have over 1,000 museums in Poland. The majority of them are state-run institutions or run by local authorities. It is rare that a museum operates in public-private partnership, and private museums are extremely rare among these big institutions. That is why government policies are so important in the museum sector. They have huge impact on the museums that we will be happy to discuss later on. And this impact is visible in particular in the context of art museums and history museums that we are going to talk about. I don't want to take too much of your time before asking questions to our discussants. So I will just mention that when we discuss the main strategies of museums in this context of official politics, and especially memory politics, it is often said that we can contrast affirmative and critical museums. And this is true, of course, but it is also a model that needs to be nuanced a bit. And I think we will try to nuance it, mentioning not only affirmative museums, national memory museums, critical museums, and museums who try to negotiate with these central patterns, follow some of the very well established solutions, but partially polemically. So that's where I would like to somehow end this very general introduction and try to start the real conversation. So the first thing I would like to discuss with our distinguished guests is about the value of museums as such. Museums are, of course, perceived as trustworthy, as reliable, as sources of solid knowledge. They are also seen as useful in the context of economy, but also in the context of politics. And at the same time, contemporary museums are often just likable, and audiences associate them with entertainment. And of course, this authority, this usefulness, and this pleasure can also be questioned and disputed. So, Erika and Joanna, you are researchers who investigate museums and at the same time work with museums, collaborate with them. Why do people and government value museums? Should they? And why should we care about museums as citizens, as researchers, but also as people who can find some pleasure visiting them? So, Erika, would you like to somehow share your experience about this in both Polish and global context?
Absolutely. Well, let me just say, first of all, thank you, Maria, and thank you so much to the Toby Foundation and Hillis for inviting us to have this conversation. I'm really pleased to be here speaking to you all and with my colleagues. So I would like to start this conversation outside of Poland with a bit of broader context, and a context that I think might be a little bit closer to home for at least some of today's audience, people situated in North America in particular. So one reason that we should care about museums is because they're actually highly contested sites, as Maria sort of suggested. The research in North America suggests that museums are indeed one of the most trusted institutions, but that is only unless you are Indigenous or African American. And this sort of lays the groundwork or points to three reasons that I'd like to mention why museums have emerged as central sites for cultural debate. And I should also stress that in the US, but also in other countries, this debate has become particularly inflamed after the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and other African Americans in early 2020. So we're seeing really a kind of tipping point or a moment of reckoning with museums globally, really. And this is where communities who feel that they have been misrepresented or mistreated by museums are gaining a more visible platform to air some of their longstanding grievances. So the first reason for this debate around museums is that, as one of the catchiest activist slogans puts it, museums are not neutral. And actually, a foundational museum studies scholar, Carol Duncan, describes museums as being deceitful because they are institutions that portray themselves as holding universal values and being a kind of common social good at the very same moment that they obscure the very highly political work that they also do. And they do this work by selecting certain objects, cutting them out of their original contexts, and framing them in new ways that give them new meanings and new values. And these are typically values that celebrate the nation. This happens, of course, in the same way that historical precursors to modern museums, so these were these princely cabinets of curiosity in Europe, that these glorified the power and the overseas reach of the individual European rulers. And this points to the second reason why museums are so central to global civic debate, because many of our museums are essentially containers for the spoils of centuries of a colonial world order, where Europeans freely pillaged the globe and also, in very enduring ways, created knowledge systems that portrayed non-Europeans as subhuman or lesser than white Europeans. And a final reason for debate in North America is that museums also remain one of our whitest cultural institutions. And this is true in relation to leadership and staff at all levels, except, of course, for security guards, where you have a lot of African Americans. So as inhabitants of countries that use museums for purposes of statecraft and international diplomacy, we should think about what kinds of tools they are, in who is in charge of them, and to what ends they are used. Now, I realize that the demographics and the conversations are quite different in Poland, and the debate about so-called decolonizing museums is very new and is quite complicated by a number of historical and political factors in Poland. But to the last part of Maria's question about, like, as a researcher, museums are simply fascinatingly complex institutions with often internally contradictory politics, and trying to understand how they make meaning with all of their different levels and structures and languages that they use to communicate and create value makes them very irresistible as a researcher. And as a citizen of the world, I see them as both, on the one hand, monuments to global injustice, and on the other hand, amazing, but also really underexplored containers for so many untold stories of global intergroup interaction that have really been silenced by particularly narrow ways of curating. And I believe that we should reclaim museums in the service of telling new kinds of stories about ourselves. So that's my first offering. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joanna. Would you like to add something to that before we dive into Polish context?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much for the invitation to the Toby Center. It's always very nice to engage in a conversation with Erika and Maria. So I'm really, really pleased to be here. Well, just very well, I can echo what Erika has just said. What I would like to stress and underline that why to care, to answering your question, Maria, why should we care about museums as both citizens and as researchers? It is because many of them are actually sponsored with public money. So this is why we should try to see and try to make them accountable for what they do. And as citizens, we can do that just going to a museum and discussing the narratives. But as researchers, we can do more. We can analyze the stories. We can talk to the curators. We can survey the publics and to see how they fit the present, the museum stories, how they engage with the present needs of the societies. So myself, I'm a historian and sociologist by my background. So I'm mainly interested, or my previous research was mainly related to the history museums. And the history museums are really peculiar comparing to the, let's say, ethnography or art museums, who are nowadays very much discussed during the colonial debates, because they're less about objects. The history museums are more about stories. The objects are very often secondary to them because there are museums projects, many of those which you've shown already, Maria, the Polish museums, new projects which are being funded without collections. The stories, the narratives, they come first, and then they are just illustrated by objects. But then it's really interesting and important for the publics what kind of stories we tell, what kind of the stories we privilege over the others, and who has the right to tell and authority to tell the stories. And in Europe, there is a plenty and a myriad of various stories and various narrative museums with different identity projects, which makes it really interesting for researchers to study them. So let's say, like, one example is the European History Museum in Brussels, which tries to tell the history of Europe, which is at the same time a really challenging way, idea to make it, but and it's very much contested from various sides. But the very idea of to make a history of Europe was already a challenge to the national museums, which were funded in the different countries of Europe, which tried to overpass national narratives, of overcome national ways of telling the history. But also regional museums, regional histories, local histories, which often clash in polemics with that what is being told on the more national or transnational level. So all of that is extremely interesting for researchers to study how actually our identities developed and how we use the past, how we use history to find our way in the present and also in the future. There's this famous saying that the one who controls the past controls the future, and that's why the museums are important. And they are very active. The museums are important because they have exhibitions, but nowadays they're also very active in the other sorts of public engagement, because they can be active in education. They can also be active in shaping public debates about history and about other important processes. So that's why they are important for us.
Thank you so much. What you just said about the uses of the past and about the accountability of museums brings us directly to this Polish context. So my second question is about, let's say, this. Is there anything special about Polish situation, about the situation of museums in Poland and maybe in the region? If we should care about museums in Poland, somewhat in particular, why is that? Can your research experience in investigating both Polish and non-Polish memory, culture and heritage help reframing somehow challenges that Poland faces concerning memory and museums? What can a museum scholar say, but also what is your personal experience? What fuels your research on Polish museums? Joanna, would you like to start?
I would start with a historic angle, a little bit of historic angle. That's what you say, because obviously, everyone likes to think that, his country or nationality is somehow special, but everyone is somehow special. But what makes, let's say, East Central Europe interesting on the global map of very special and peculiar museum stories is the post-1989 transformation. So that's the experience of the communist period and before the very violent experience of the Second World War, and what and an attempt to work through both of these experience in the heritage sector of the post-1989 in the post-1989 context, 3 decades already. And what I would say, I would kind of distinguish 3 phases of that process. The first one would be the 1990s, when on the one hand the heritage sector is still very much underfunded, and especially Poland is really a poor country and struggling with huge economic issues and deprivation in the 1990s. But on the one hand, and on the other, all these stories which were frozen in the communist time, which surfaced in the 1990s, which are the Holocaust, of course, and Erika will talk about it later more, the Gulag, but also the anti-communist partisanship, various regional histories, which for various reasons the stories couldn't be told in public before in the communist time. So there is this period of filling the blank spots, which is also accompanied by the so-called archival revolution in historiography. But then there comes a moment of the accession to the EU of Poland and several other countries of East Central Europe, and this is the moment of what you have called, Maria, the museum boom, because this is where the money starts to, being accessible to the museums. And that's also the moment of when I would say, there starts a competition of various narratives and of various identity projects, which can use a more spectacular means to develop or to pack a narrative. So there are these several museums which you mentioned, of which I would just underline the very importance of the Warsaw Rising Museum, we started with very much national or even nationalistic narratives, which kind of downplayed the stories of let's say Poles of non-Polish background. But then there are other museums which start to stress the, let's say, the Jewish part of the of Poland, as especially Polin museums of the history of Polish Jews, but also also several other projects. And then there are like the museums which also try to tell the broader stories of Poland in the European or the global context, as the Museum of the Second World War in Gdańsk. So there are like several big money, several years, which takes, to build these museums, different political stakeholders which are interested in developing these museums. Some of them are more on the liberal side, some of them are more on the conservative side. And that would be the second phase, the phase which you have called the museum boom. And then I would I would like to also underline the importance of the third phase, which I would say it starts after 2015, which is the populist takeover of power, when the Law and Justice, the governing party, the one which is still in power, wins. And what they try to do is they try to, let's say, they try to impose a single nationalistic narrative over all the most important museum sites in Poland, the one which would be fitting the political goals, but it would also kind of unite the society against whatever, some trends of globalization, which they are not very happy about. So that would be my very rough summary of what happened in Poland. But what also I would like to underline that we try to concentrate, or we tend to concentrate on these big museum projects, but there are many, many other museums in Poland. They are, city museums, which I've studied. There are local museums which are not necessarily entangled in all these big debates, and they try to have their own voice on several subject matters. But that was a brief introduction, and I guess Erika will just feed us with more subtle Jewish-Polish matter and how does it fit into the general story.
Thanks so much. I guess that what you just said announces so many topics that some of them we will be able to elaborate on, but certainly not all of them. So, Erika, I guess that you could somehow use your profound experience in researching Jewish and other minorities' stories being integrated or not being integrated into narratives of Polish museums to somehow add to this Polish museum landscape we are trying to sketch here.
Yes, I will try. Thank you so much. And I should say that question about how to integrate Jewish stories into Polish museums, and particularly these ethnographic museums, is the subject of my text in Maria's special issue of Teksty Drugie, which also it started as an English language text. So if anyone's interested, because I can only briefly touch on it, I would be happy to share that article. So basically, on the question of why care about museums in Poland, and I should say that I personally have perhaps two main fascinations at the moment regarding museums in Poland. And one is the place of Jews and other minority groups in museums that purport to represent some idea of the Polish nation. And particularly, as mentioned, sort of how Jews are being integrated, attempts to integrate them as, these conversations about the Polish nation, about the Holocaust, et cetera, become are sort of, taking up a lot of the news. So there is a little bit of a sense of pressure. So what are the challenges to museums and different kinds of museums when they try to integrate Jews? And the other question that interests me is how one can think about and also productively employ these increasingly global calls to decolonize museums, how one can do that in the Polish context. So what might this mean, and what might it look like to do decolonial museology in Poland, which of course is a country that did not have its own overseas colonies? And of course, many people use this fact to sort of dismiss the relevance of decolonial museology in its entirety. These two questions come together particularly clearly, I think, in ethnographic museums. So these are museums about culture. And they grew out of 19th century disciplines like cultural anthropology and ethnology and folklore. And I should say, I am a cultural anthropologist by training, so hence my particular gravitation towards this type of museum. I should stress, and I think Joanna kind of made a wonderful opening for this, that, you know, my interest here is quite far afield from these headline news-making museums, which are mostly the big new history museums that have been so powerful and so disputed. And they're also the new Jewish museums. These were also mentioned, of which there are an increasing number of smaller. There's Polin, but then also some smaller.
Rika, you are muted for a reason.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yourself? Yes, now it works.
Sorry about that. I'm just reminding us, as Maria mentioned, that there are over 1,000 museums in Poland, of which very few get international attention. But a recent survey indicates that about 200 of these museums actually have Judaica in their collections. And these other museums also tell stories about and make claims about the nation and the place of Jews and other minorities in the nation. And maybe especially because they're not telling straightforward, obvious historical stories, they do this in more subtle ways. And therefore, they really deserve our attention. School children, for example, are often silently taught what I think are very powerful lessons about who is us and who is other in Poland in this kind of local museum. So I just wanted to very briefly show you 2 or 3 slides that illustrate the kinds of things that interest me. So this first slide is the facade of the Krakow Ethnographic Museum, which sits on the edge of the city's historical Jewish quarter called Kazimierz. And this building actually used to be the city hall at one point, and it also served as a Jewish school. So part of my argument for the need to think about so-called decolonizing museology is that the very idea of an ethnographic museum is a colonial type of institution. So these are institutions that grew up with the idea of, you know, intercultural contact and collecting things from elsewhere in Central Europe, also from local others like peasants or other potentially other minority groups. But so these sort of colonial ideas are embedded in the very structure of these museums, in ideas about social groups and also ways of thinking about culture and about objects that are quite problematic, that many people would agree are outmoded, and also for me as a curator present simply lost opportunities to tell really fascinating stories that are perhaps more relevant to present day issues and challenges. If I could have my second slide, please. So in 2008, this museum, the Ethnographic Museum in Krakow, got a new director and was also somewhat updated in response to these new global trends calling for the democratization and increased social relevance of museums. And this museum, I should say, has legitimately done some quite interesting and progressive experiments in a new kind of what we might call sort of postmodern museology. But I have been continually both provoked and inspired by their new slogan in 2008, which continues today, that heralded this shift in their orientation. You can see here it says both in Polish and in English, "My museum, a museum about me." So who exactly, I keep asking myself, is the me, this perhaps collective me, that the museum is invoking, and who should identify with this museum as their own museum? Could I have my third slide, please? So what I would like to argue is that this museum's displays make pretty clear that this me, the person who could feel that this museum is their museum, is a Slavic Catholic Pole. So despite the fact that Jews, as we know, made up large proportions of Polish settlements in the pre-war era, of the kind that this museum largely depicts, Jews in the museum show up only as objects of their Catholic neighbors' interest, not as actual subjects or actors in Polish social life. And I have 3 examples here that demonstrate both the assumed audience of the museum, so the sort of normative Catholic pole, but they also point to these missed opportunities to tell more complicated stories about Catholic Poles and their Jewish Polish neighbors together, their mutual influences, and their sharing and exchange of culture, and also their difficult experiences living with each other. So you can see here in this slide 3 types of objects, which as a shorthand I've labeled the caricature, the hybrid, and the commemorative. These objects are really complex, and their problematic nature is silenced by these traditional, and I would say colonial, curatorial approaches that the museum still generally uses, or uses in many places, which sees cultures as bounded, homogeneous units that stand really outside of history and politics. They have a sort of timeless quality. And the museum also takes a rather authoritative scientific approach to displays that ignore the possibility of audiences having diverse perspectives, having their own expertise on certain issues, and also their own connections, sometimes conflicted, difficult connections to the materials on display. So on the left, you can see a caricatured mask of a Jew, which is used in seasonal rituals like springtime or Christmas time caroling. So this has long been framed, this kind of thing has long been framed only as amusing folk culture, not taking into consideration the way it participates in a long-standing genealogy of anti-Semitic visual culture. In the middle, and this is a fascinating example for me, in the middle is a noisemaker that is displayed as a Polish Catholic terkotka, which is used during Holy Week to call people to church, for example. But it could just as well be a Jewish Purim grugger, which is what I thought it was when I first saw it growing up in a Jewish household in the United States. And so, it could be framed as both, or as an object of obviously shared or exchanged culture, but it's not. And on the right, you see a kind of quite complex post-traumatic Holocaust witness art that has largely been not displayed, actually, because it doesn't fit well into the category of folk art, which is a very traditional form that is displayed in Polish ethnographic museums. But folk art is generally understood as bucolic, as not having a history, not related to politics or traumatic memory. And so many of these objects simply have languished in archives. I just want to be clear that I have a wonderful, complex working relationship with the Krakow Ethnographic Museum. I have a dear colleague who I've worked with on many collaborative projects, and the director has also worked with us to do some critical experiments. And also some really important changes have been made in this museum. So what I'm trying to illustrate here is really the kinds of problems that ethnographic museums and ethnographic museums in Poland in particular have in terms of trying to integrate truly meaningful Jewish stories that can be also told from a Jewish perspective. And as noted, I spin that out more in my article in Maria's edited collection.
Thank you so much. So now I think that we have to address the question that is also, I think, very interesting for our audience, as it is already visible in the comments. I mean the Polish government policies in the museum sector and cultural sector as such, as well as in the context of politics of memory. And of course, this, let's say, impact of national or nationalistic policies in the museum sector is not solely a Polish problem, and similar tensions can be identified in many countries in and beyond East Central Europe. And in particular, both Polish and Hungarian semi-authoritative governments intervene in the museum sector in a way that bear striking resemblance. And it is also elaborated on in our issue by a brilliant museum scholar Liliana Radomich. So it is well known how Polish government operates within the framework of this so-called competitive memory in their memory politics. So they focus on memory conflicts and on maintaining positive self-image. And national memory museums contribute to these politics. But there are also more direct actions of the governments that are aimed at overpowering these museums that define their missions differently. So we can observe removals of directors and forced changes in the exhibitions and applying pressure that makes people resign, like in the case of the Auschwitz Committee. So my question is, what will be results of such policies? Do you notice already some cases of the chilling effect in the work of museums professionals or even self-censorship? And how can the museum's achievements be safeguarded? Can we as museum researchers and as museum audiences somehow contribute to safeguarding what has been already achieved by Polish museums? So maybe we can start with Joanna now as well, as Erika was the last speaker. Please, Joanna.
Well, first of all, I just want to say that it's highly deplorable what is going on, but I think that there are two dimensions of that process. So one is that what really hits the headlines, and this is what the international public learns about. So what some of you might have heard were the changes in the directors of some of the main museums, which Maria mentioned at the beginning. So one was, I think, the first famous case was when the Paweł Machcewicz, who was the founding director of the Second World War Museum in Gdańsk, when he was dismissed. And what followed was a slight change in the narrative of the museum. That was a slight change, which really of several objects, which changed the framing of the entire very rich narrative into much narrow national story. So even though the changes were relatively small, they were made into such places of the exhibition which changed the main meaning of the story. And that was the dismissal of Paweł Machcewicz was followed by by dismissals of other museum director. Again, the case which hit the headlines was what happened to Dariusz Stola, who was the first again a director of the Polin Museum of the History of Polish Jews, who contributed to the worldwide success of that museum, and he was actually appointed for the second term after winning the call for in the open competition, and simply his nomination was not signed by the Minister of Culture. But when the changes were. What happened in that museum was not that profound as it was the case in the Second World War Museum, because the people who were on board of the museum tried to secure the Polin as it worked before, as it used to work before. Then again, a huge scandal was when. Culture Minister Gliński appointed Barbara Szydło, who was a former Prime Minister of Poland, but her only museum experience is, I think, that she studied ethnography, in the 70s or 80s, and then she had a small apprenticeship with museums later on, maybe. But she was appointed for a 4-year term under Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum Council. And so without any, let's say, justification of that appointment, only the political one. So that was a huge scandal with three other board members resigning after that. So that's a global picture, and that's what really the people who read the newspapers they know about that. But then there is a huge, let's say, word of the Polish curators, who I would say are very diverse. So when Maria asked about the chilling effect, it's really difficult to say. So some museums will change the narratives, as happened in the Gdańsk Museum of the Second World War. Some of them will try not to do, and some of them, which are not at the spotlight of the government, will just continue to do things. So I would say that that's a very diverse picture. So yeah, I don't know, maybe Erika has a different view into that.
So the only thing I would like to do now is to maybe also to reframe the question a bit, because of course it's important to like identify dangers and threats. But I would like us also to mention something about good practices and about museums' futures. So, Erika, could you maybe add something also on what are the conditions that can enable progressive change in museums, however rare they may be now in Poland, and how can we contribute to making this kind of change happen? How can our experiences be fruitful for the museum's future in these times of political unrest?
Okay, I'm going to be really brief because I see Helise isn't here with us, and I'm sure, because I'm looking at the time, that she's suggesting that we probably want to take questions. So let me just very briefly say, I think that one problem that I think it's worth thinking about is that museums typically change due to external pressure by activists. I mean, they change in progressive ways due to external pressure by people who are part of minority groups who feel misrepresented or mistreated by museums. But of course, in Poland, groups representing either historical or some of the newer minorities are so small or so disempowered that they either simply have other priorities or they don't really want to rock the boat. I think these questions, the larger discourses of decolonizing, are sort of they're having trouble arriving or really kind of gaining a lot of traction in Poland. I do think, though, that I have like a way to mitigate this problem of not having the local minority voices is to collaborate with international partners, and that comes without external funding and external prestige, which can be a kind of protection for progressive actors in Poland to have these partnerships. On the other hand, ultimately, maybe it has limited efficacy in the face of like real repression from above. But I do think that, especially in the smaller institutions, some of these external partnerships can be really helpful. I just want to mention one thing I'm thinking about is that there's this wonderful group called Festiwalt, which is a small, new, about 3 years old, critical Jewish arts organization in Poland that is working generally outside of traditional institutional frameworks to critique local heritage manifestations. They're doing most of their work in Krakow, but they're drawing local citizens, politicians, and foreign actors into their work with some really provocative results. And I just want to mention that, they, this is something I also participated in, but they really started a conversation with some local politicians and other people about these problematic Jewish figurines holding coins, which have this really kind of, anti-Semitic kind of, atmosphere around them. And recently, a bunch of people, including some government members locally, the municipal government, wrote an open letter, which I also was a signatory to. Essentially, bans are not my favorite, but trying to sort of ban the sale and in any case, draw attention to the problematic nature of these. So I think these questions of partnering across different institutions, working within and outside of institutions in Poland and outside with activists, scholars, community members, et cetera, is really a useful way to go.
Thank you so much for this brilliant example. And now, Helise, I guess we have some questions to answer. Is that right?
First of all, we don't want to stop us in the middle of this amazing conversation. I think we're just getting to so many other pieces of what we'd all like to hear about and learn about. But I would like to share a few questions. There's quite a buzz in the comment section. The first question comes from Stefan Shevchuk from Johannesburg. What role can virtual museums play in presenting history? Since Central and Eastern European history is intertwined, can comment be made on an integrated museum? Would any of you like to address that sort of general question?
Well, I guess that this is such a huge topic, especially after the year of the pandemic, when we are so much used to these virtual experiences in these areas that we were not absolutely used to like a year and a half before, but at the same time we may be somehow fed up with these Zoom experiences and ask questions about whether virtual museums can really play similar roles to the non-virtual ones, or maybe they just need to be somehow like invented anew with some new roles and new functions. I'm not sure what you think about it, and I guess that your experience in researching city museums in Joanna in many countries of the world can maybe somehow inspire some thoughts on this question as well.
Maybe just very briefly, because it is a huge question, but it's but probably more coming up. So I mean, obviously the virtual museums can. And I mean, they cannot really replace the museum, and this is what is really interesting in that. So the people still look for the kind of the real experience and kind of the real object experience, but they can enrich the museum work. So what they help, for instance, when we have all these, as Erika calls them, implicated collections, right? Which are now the museums are looking into the origins of the collections, which are very much, coming from the violent moments of the history, including colonial history, but any other colonial. So they cannot be all put on display, but they can in the actual museum. But you can use the virtual space to actually put the objects to work on how they are, how the stories are being told, but also to look for the source communities of those objects. And so the virtual space can help museums, and it can also obviously help the people who cannot go to a museum to have some kind of the experience of that museums. And the museums in the last 2 years, the museums were really made a huge learning step how to do that.
Helise, would it be okay if I touch on this question of the decolonial and decolonizing that I see has come up in the chat?
Absolutely. And then we have one more that we will select, and then we will continue this conversation another time. So yes, Erika, please do.
Great. Well, I mean, this is a great question. And honestly, I'm at the very beginning of my thinking this through, because at some point in my research, I noticed that I was sort of importing whole cloth from my situatedness here in Canada, where so much of the critique of museums is the decolonial critique, because we are now recognized as being wholly a settler colonial nation, and the political power that Indigenous communities have is such that that is the sort of the guiding thrust of the discourse, as it is in Western Europe as well. So I mean, the question comes up, and I really appreciate it, has come up from my colleagues in Krakow and elsewhere. How fitting is this to sort of transport that discourse to Poland? And in fact, am I doing a sort of colonizing gesture myself by imposing this external foreign, sort of discourse on Poland? And I think it's so important. We absolutely have to think through the different and complex implication of Poland and other East Central European countries in the colonial world order, because of course, I mean, I think we shouldn't permit the conversation to stop by saying Poland didn't have colonies, because of course, Polish explorers, Polish missionaries, Polish travelers of all sorts profited from and benefited and did all of their work and travels, etc., on the back of the colonial world order. They participated in French and German and Russian expeditions abroad. So it's absurd to say that Poland has nothing to do with that. We have to ask, well, where did the Polish overseas collections come from? But the stuff that's more important to me is really the kind of systems of knowledge that I think are still with us. And I think, thinking about, there is this moment where there's real power in the discourse and the political energy that has attached to this idea of decolonizing museums, that even though it may be an imperfect metaphor, I think it's really worth working with. We have to be careful with it, but we need to work with it rather than against it, and think how it might apply. I don't want, there's a lot of critique that decolonization should not be simply a metaphor, that it means concrete things, especially for Indigenous people. But I think I would love to leave you with the idea that when we talk about decolonizing the museum, we mean things like acknowledging the harm caused by the institution, amplifying the voices and narratives of communities that have been marginalized or have stories told about them that they don't appreciate, or that are untrue, imbuing the objects and collections with the missing meanings, and also collaborating with really diverse communities. So not only in curating and collecting, but in the membership of their boards, in the diversity of their staffs, in the programming and education and outreach. So I think I don't want to, I don't want to dismiss all of this by saying, well, there's a complicated history with colonialism in Poland. I think that this is something that Joanna and I are just starting a new project to try to think through some of these very complicated issues. And perhaps she wants to say something on that subject.
Yeah, because I've just completed a short, I co-authored just a chapter about that, and exactly trying to answer that important question, which is how decolonization fits into the Polish context. And we are comparing the let's say, Dutch experience of colonization and attempts of decolonization, Polish and Chinese, trying to argue that there is no single way to decolonization, but also trying to understand how the East Central Europe fits into that. So one is what Erika already mentioned, or like twofold. So one is because of the history. So you can't really think about the history of that region of the world in separate to that what happened in the 19th, 20th century. These are entangled stories. The white, people from East Central Europe, they kind of benefited from the aspects of colonization, even though Poland had no colonies, it aspired to have some in the interwar period. So there is the first ethnographic museums which were funded in Poland in the independent state, were funded on the objects, used the objects which were taken from Cameroon by the Polish expedition of the officer who was actually wanted to kind of colonize Cameroon before Germans, like in a kind of the competitions with German, and then those objects became stored in the Polish history. But also there is an interesting post-war history when, as you know, Poland is kind of moves on the map, right, to the west, and it gains the post-German, not only territories, but some of the post-German collections, which some of them come from Africa or from Australia, and they are given to Poland, right, as a compensation for the World War II crimes. So these are really very, very complicated stories and very complicated ethical issues, which we only now start to uncover, but this is how the very complex meaning of the colonization comes to East Central Europe, and it's not marginal at all, I think.
So first of all, thank you. For all of us who are reading the comments, there are quite a lot of provocative and thoughtful and inspiring and conversations going on. We will share those we will keep those conversations, because I think all three of you would like to review them, come back to them. I hope that you will join us again. I'm going to take the liberty before we close is to ask just one more question. How do we become more responsible visitors as museum-going citizens? How do we hold a museum accountable for its authenticity and presenting conflicting narratives? What do we do as the public?
Oh, this is huge, I would say. And of course, in the context of all these museums that somehow try to show us some ways of interpreting the past in order to offer us something like a memory training, to train us somehow in collectively remembering in a way. I guess that what we should do is to somehow try to, let's say, contribute to teaching and learning critical thinking at the same time. And I guess that the museum can be a perfect space for training this kind of critical thinking. As visitors, for instance, when we visit these national memory museums and so on, we may be asking questions about why this space is arranged this way, why this wall is painted red, what do I hear, and why, what vibe, what atmosphere does it create, and so on. And I guess this may be a way to somehow use museums in a very positive way to follow their narratives, but also to have this, let's say, generally critical approach towards what we are trained for as museum visitors. Rika.
If I may just add one thing, I mean, absolutely, and that's what I try to do in my teaching. And there's actually a fabulous article, which I'm sure Helise would be happy to circulate to people, by a scholar named Margaret Lindauer, called How to Be a Critical Museum Visitor. And it's a really wonderful kind of step-by-step guide. It's great for students, great for all of us to think about how to prepare yourself, even when you're just standing outside the building thinking, what are they going to try to make me think before I even walk in?
Excellent. Well, happy to share it. Joanna, one final comment would you like to add?
Yeah, just very quickly, you can also think of giving feedback to curators when you are unhappy about something or feel uncomfortable with. So.
And one last sentence, that as, of course, critical citizens, we can also think about supporting museums when they are being under danger or under threat by some policies that are arranged by governments or some groups of interests.
So I don't want to stop. The questions that remain and the questions you've already raised give us a lot of opportunity to think further and to talk more. And you've clearly connected all of us who are participating, but all of those of us who are interested all around the world in how we are visitors, how we are researchers, how do we look, how do we ask. And clearly your conversation, which was most welcome, is making us really think beyond the exhibit, beyond the title of the exhibit. And I hope that the words that you've shared with us and your scholarship is really empowering to all of those of you who've joined us. So thank you, Erica, Joanna, and Maria, for joining us and for your thought-provoking conversation. We all look forward to visiting a museum with you, to reading the article first to prepare ourselves, but to do some critical thinking of our own and sharing it with others. I want to thank our TJHT Talks team, Jakub Wyszak and Kaja Zizek. And most importantly, thank you, dear participants. TJHT Talks is supported solely by contributions from you, and we're grateful to those who've already contributed. If you'd like to make a donation, you'll find information on how to make a tax-deductible contribution in the email which will follow this webinar. And we look forward to seeing you at our next session of TJHT Talks on Wednesday, August 18th. And in the meantime, please stay safe, healthy, and well. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Good night. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.